Grocery shopping in the 1970s in Britain meant no loyalty apps tracking your spending, no out-of-town superstores swallowing the afternoon, no self-checkout screen to navigate alone, no frozen ready meals filling half the floor space. What you had was the high street, a shopping bag, a handwritten list, and a weekly budget that inflation was steadily consuming. The 3-day week had unsettled everyone. Prices rose month by month without apology. But every week you went. You planned, you queued, you carried your bags home on the bus. Let's walk through what grocery shopping in 1970s Britain actually felt like. Let's step into that world. Planning the weekly shop started with the local newspaper. Not for the news or not primarily. You opened it for the grocery advertisements tucked inside. The half-page announcements from the Co-op. From fine fare, from international stores, setting out what was on offer this week and at what price. You would sit at the kitchen table, sometimes with a cup of tea going cold beside you, and you would read the prices carefully. You would compare them. You would note which shop had the better deal on mince and which had the cheaper butter. The differences were small, sometimes only a penny or two in either direction, but pennies mattered in a way that is difficult to overstate now. Inflation in Britain during the 1970s reached 25% by 1975. Something that cost 30 pence in January might cost 38 pence by August. You noticed. Every shopper noticed. The weekly bill that had felt manageable in 1971 felt punishing by 1976, and there was no sign it intended to stop. Your shopping list was written on paper, or often on the back of an envelope, or on the small notepad kept in the kitchen drawer for exactly this purpose. You did not organise it by aisle because you were not going to one shop. You organised it by destination. The Co-op for staples and to register your dividend number. The butcher on the high street for meat. The greengrocer 2 doors along for fruit and veg, where the produce was fresher and the prices better than anything the chains offered. Perhaps the baker as well. The weekly shop was a circuit, a planned route through a series of specific stops, not a single transaction completed under one roof. No single shop had everything. You built your list around that fact. The Co-op dividend was its own institution, and it ran on a number every member carried in their head, your divvy number. And you gave it at the till with every purchase, and the Co-op calculated your share of the profits based on your accumulated spending across the year, returning it as cash or as credit. Families treated the annual payout as a small but reliable windfall. Some resisted spending it on ordinary shopping so it would accumulate into something worth having. The divvy number was recalled as automatically as a telephone number, as naturally as your own address. It was the closest thing to a loyalty scheme that most British shoppers knew, and it predated the computerised point systems of later decades by the better part of a century. Green Shield stamps ran alongside it in many shops. You collected them at the till based on your total spend, licked them at home in the evening, and pressed them into the small buff-coloured books. And when you had filled enough books, you took them to the redemption centre and exchanged them for goods from the catalogue. Toasters, blankets, sets of saucepans, things the household needed, but the weekly budget could not easily absorb. Families saved books for months, working steadily towards something specific. Children were given the task of licking and sticking, which was considered mildly exciting and immediately unpleasant in equal measure. The catalogue sat on the kitchen table and was consulted with a seriousness it had earned. The British grocery chains of the 1970s were a different map entirely from the one that exists now. Tesco was not yet dominant. In the early part of the decade, it was still associated with pile-it-high, sell-it-cheap retailing, small stores with narrow aisles and plain own-label goods that made no pretense at sophistication. Fine fare operated across much of England. International stores held high street positions that would eventually be sold or closed or absorbed into larger groups. Lipton's was contracting. The Co-op was deeply embedded in working class communities, particularly across the North and the Midlands, its stores varying enormously in size and quality from one town to the next, but consistent in their sense of belonging to the community around them. Sainsbury's was considered fractionally upmarket, its stores better organised, its fruit and veg section more reliably stocked, its prices a little higher. You shopped where your budget and your postcode directed you. Getting to the shops was not, for most families, a matter of driving, and car ownership was lower than it would become, and the weekly shop had not yet reorganised itself around the boot of a family saloon and a distant retail park. You walked or you took the bus, or a neighbour with a car arranged a combined Saturday morning trip that required coordination and goodwill in roughly equal measure. This shaped everything about how you shopped. You carried what you bought. The weight of the bags on the walk to the bus stop was a direct constraint on the size of your shop, as immediate and practical as any budget. You bought what the week required. Running short of something midweek meant doing without until the next trip, or making a separate journey that cost bus fare you may not have wanted to spend. The oil crisis of 1973 fed into the cost of everything on the shelf. Transport costs rose. Heating costs for shops rose. Packaging became more expensive to produce. It arrived in prices at exactly the moment when the 3-day working week was cutting household incomes for many working families. The weekly shop happened inside all of that pressure week after week, and the shopper who sat at the kitchen table on Wednesday evening with the newspaper and the list was doing something that looked like routine but was in fact a small and repeated act of household management under conditions that rewarded attention and punished carelessness. You planned your route, you checked your purse or your wallet, you went. The grocery shops of 1970s, Britain announced themselves before you were through the door. The smell reached you first, cool, damp air from the fruit and veg, and floor polish worked into linoleum that had been buffed so many times it held its own particular shine, cardboard from stacked deliveries near the back, and underneath everything the faint metallic cold of the refrigerated cases. Fluorescent lights ran the full length of the ceiling and hummed at a frequency you stopped registering within 30 seconds. The music, where there was any, came through a single overhead speaker and was easy listening, quiet enough to talk across without raising your voice. You collected a basket from the stack near the entrance. The wire handles bit into your palm when the weight built up. You learned to transfer it from hand to hand without thinking about it. The fruit and veg section sat at the front of most shops, and in winter it told you precisely what month it was. No imported strawberries in February. So no courgettes in November. No avocados at any time of year in any ordinary high street shop. What there was British and seasonal, and sometimes not particularly lovely to look at. Potatoes in muddy paper sacks. Carrots with their green tops still on. Cabbages dense and slightly waxy, the outer leaves peeled back to show something fresher underneath. Onions loose in a bin you reached into yourself. Cooking apples and eating apples and very little else in the way of fruit through the colder months. You selected individual items, you weighed them on the scale, noted the price per pound on the paper bag in pencil, and moved along. The honour system trusted you to weigh and mark correctly. Most people did. The butcher counter required a number. You tore your ticket from the dispenser on the edge of the counter and you waited. So watching the queue reduce one customer at a time, listening to the conversation between the butcher and the woman ahead of you about what was good this week and what to avoid. The butcher stood behind the glass case in a white coat that was not entirely white by mid-morning. He knew his regulars. You told him what you wanted and he cut it fresh. Stewing beef for Tuesday's casserole, chops for the grill, brisket for Sunday if the budget allowed. He wrapped it in white paper with a folding efficiency that spoke of 10,000 previous parcels, wrote the price on the outside with a grease pencil, and handed it across. You could ask him to mince a specific cut. Regulars received advice freely, along with the better stock and the fresher cuts. The relationship with your butcher was worth building and worth keeping. In the counter smelled of raw meat and refrigerated air, and the faint sawdust scattered across the floor behind the glass. The dairy section was compact and familiar. Milk in the early part of the decade still arrived on the doorstep in glass bottles, the milkman completing his round before the street was awake. But the transition to plastic containers and waxed cardboard cartons was well underway by the mid-70s. You checked the date carefully. Milk spoiled faster than what would come later, and a bottle a day past its best was a bottle left where it was. Cheese was overwhelmingly cheddar, mild or mature, with double Gloucester and red Leicester as alternatives that felt almost adventurous by comparison. Stilton appeared near Christmas. Continental varieties belonged to delicatessens and specialist shops, and not to the ordinary weekly run. Yoghurt was plain or strawberry, and came in small glass pots. Eggs were in paper cartons, usually a half dozen, usually white. The biscuit aisle was its own particular geography, and British shoppers navigated it with a seriousness it deserved. McVitie's digestives, rich tea, bourbons, custard creams, jammy Dodgers, Garibaldis, arranged along the shelf in their familiar packaging. Broken biscuits sold loose, weighed out by the pound into a plain paper bag, were significantly cheaper than their intact equivalents and tasted identical. Families with children conducted quiet negotiations here. The child wanted the chocolate ones. The budget suggested plain. The compromise arrived at, after a moment of diplomatic silence, was often a packet of rich tea and a small treat alongside, and a club bar or a penguin tucked in at the edge of the basket without ceremony. Tinned goods dominated the centre aisles entirely. Heinz baked beans, Heinz tomato soup, Heinz spaghetti and tomato sauce, the red and white labels as familiar as wallpaper. Frey Bentos steak and kidney pies in their round, flat tins, the pastry lid revealed when you peeled back the top after heating. Campbell's soup in its British versions. Del Monte tinned peaches and pears in syrup, opened on Sunday for pudding. Bird's Eye controlled the frozen vegetable section, peas above all else, and mixed vegetables in a solid block dropped directly into boiling water. Tinned goods were the structural foundation of 1970s British cooking. They were cheap, they lasted indefinitely, and they formed the backbone of midweek meals assembled quickly after work. And when something went on, often you bought more than you needed today. A larder stocked with tins was a form of household security that the decade had taught people to value. The frozen section was narrow. Bird's Eye fish fingers, Wall's sausages, Lyons made ice cream in rectangular cartons, frozen peas in boxes. Vesta curries and chow mein came in dried packet form, reconstituted with boiling water, eaten with genuine appetite and a sense of mild adventure that felt entirely reasonable at the time. Fish and chips on a Friday evening came from the chip shop on the walk home, wrapped in newspaper, eaten from the paper at the kitchen table, or occasionally in the street without embarrassment. The frozen section of a 1970s British grocery shop was for convenience items and for treats, and it was not yet the vast territory it would colonize in the decade that followed. The queue at the checkout formed without instruction. British shoppers arranged themselves into orderly lines by instinct, by social contract, by a shared understanding that the queue was worth maintaining even when it moved slowly. There was one cashier per till. In smaller shops, there was no conveyor belt. You placed items on the counter one at a time, and the cashier dealt with each in turn. She looked at the price sticker, held the figure in memory or found it by habit, and typed it into the mechanical till by hand. Fast cashiers were skilled in a way that rewarded watching, a fluid rhythm of reach, check, type. The till sounding its mechanical note with each entry, into the running total accumulating toward a figure you were already calculating independently in your head. Paying meant cash, not cash as one option among several. Cash as the given, the assumed, the amount you had counted out at the kitchen table before leaving the house so that you knew precisely what you had and precisely what the limit was. Some shops accepted cheques by the mid-70s, and you would present your cheque guarantee card alongside, the cashier noting the card number on the back before accepting it. Credit cards were not for the weekly shop. The weekly shop was a cash transaction, and the discipline of a fixed sum in your purse or wallet was itself a budgeting tool. When the money was gone, the shopping was finished. No extension, no adjustment, finished. And the receipt was a ticker tape strip or a handwritten slip, and you checked it before you left the counter. Not as a gesture of suspicion, but because errors happened and you had been tracking the running total in your head throughout the shop. Sometimes the discrepancy was in your favour, sometimes it was not. Either way, you caught it because the mental arithmetic had been running continuously since the first item went into the basket. Bagging was your own responsibility. No assistant waited at the end of the counter. You packed at the till, working quickly to avoid holding up the queue behind you. Heavy tins at the bottom, bread on top, eggs in their paper carton, handled with care. The bags were brown paper, reused until the handles tore. The weight of a full bag on the walk to the bus stop, and handles pressing into your fingers in the cold, was one of the most routine physical sensations of the era. Then, in 1974, the sugar ran out. Not everywhere simultaneously, but the shortage was real and it spread quickly. Supplies tightened without warning. Shops began limiting purchases. 1 bag per customer, 2 at most. A handwritten sign taped to the shelf where the sugar had been. Shoppers who arrived early secured their allocation. Shoppers who arrived in the afternoon found empty space. The instinct to stockpile activated immediately and worsened the shortage by pulling supply forward faster than it could be replenished. Families who had never considered sugar as a vulnerable commodity found themselves scanning the shelf on every visit, buying the maximum permitted whenever it appeared, storing it at the back of the larder against the possibility that next week there would be none at all. The bread strikes introduced a different texture of uncertainty. Bakers went on strike at intervals through the decade, and the supply became intermittent in ways that were difficult to plan around. You would arrive at the baker's to find the shelves cleared, or a single variety remaining, or a handwritten notice on the door. Families adapted. Some began baking their own. Others substituted crackers, or made do with whatever remained. The sharing of information about where supplies could be found became a genuine social function of the queue and the pavement outside the shop. Had they had bread at the Co-op this morning? Was there any left at Fine Fare? The question passed between neighbours with the seriousness it deserved. The stockpiling as a habit outlasted the specific shortages that had produced it. Once you had watched a shelf empty and stay empty, the logic of buying more than today's need against tomorrow's uncertainty became difficult to argue with. You bought 6 tins of Heinz beans when you needed 2, because 6 tins at today's price was insurance against both scarcity and the price rise that was coming regardless. Your larder became a small buffer against an economy that had demonstrated convincingly and repeatedly that it could not be trusted to remain stable. The evidence of the empty shelf was more immediate than any reassurance, and people drew the obvious conclusion and acted on it. Store brands were the frugal choice, and everyone in the shop understood them to be the frugal choice, including the person buying them. A Co-op own label came in plain packaging with simple lettering that made no claim beyond the contents. Tesco basics were cheaper than branded equivalents and did not disguise this. Buying own label carried a meaning that extended beyond the product itself. It said something about how carefully you were managing, or how carefully you had to manage, and the distinction between those two conditions was not always legible from the outside. Some shoppers refused own label on principle. Others switched entirely and spent the difference on something else. The choice played out quietly in every aisle every week, understood by everyone present without needing to be spoken. What defined grocery shopping in 1970s? Britain was the human presence running through every part of it. No automation, no scanning. No system that did not depend at some point on a person making a judgment or performing a physical action. The butcher cut your meat and advised you on it, and the cashier held prices in her memory and typed them by hand. You packed your own bags and counted your own change and carried everything home yourself. And you queued. And in queuing, you talked to the person beside you about what was on offer at the Co-op this week, whether the sugar situation had improved, whether the bread was back. The weekly shop was not a transaction completed in efficient isolation. It was embedded in the social life of the street, dependent on relationships built through years of weekly visits to the same counter, the same till, the same queue. The experience was transitional in ways that most people living through it could not yet see clearly. And the corner shop model it was replacing, the small independent grocer where the shopkeeper knew every customer by name, was already retreating. The superstore model that would follow, the vast out-of-town retail parks with their trolleys and their laser scanners, had not yet arrived for most British shoppers. The 1970s sat between those two worlds, keeping some of the personal texture of the old, while beginning to absorb the scale and the impersonality of what was coming. Sainsbury's was growing larger. Tesco was investing in bigger formats. The high street circuit of butcher, greengrocer, baker and grocer was not yet finished, but the direction of travel was already set. For those who remember it, grocery shopping in 1970s Britain left impressions that are specific and physical. The smell of the butcher's counter, a sawdust and cold and white paper, and the sound of the mechanical till, its percussive rhythm of keys and the spring of the cash drawer opening, the weight of the paper bags on the walk to the bus in the cold, the relief of finding the sugar back on the shelf, the small, quiet satisfaction of a week's shopping, completed inside the budget, every item accounted for, the receipt checked, the change correct. It was a chore that required planning and patience and careful arithmetic, conducted under economic pressure that was relentless and largely beyond anyone's individual control. The shops are gone, and the high streets have changed. The world that made that particular experience necessary has passed. But for those who carried the shopping home on the bus, the memory of it remains exact.